What's going on, everyone? So it has been a pretty fun week of spoilers, and we just got a brand new Darth Vader that we have to go over today. Okay, a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you for participating in the tournament. We're starting a new one soon, which is going to be a lot of fun. But let's dive into some spoilers today because we got a decent amount of them to go through, including, as I mentioned, a brand new Darth Vader. Starting us out with Radiant 7. It's a 7 cost space unit in cunning. It's a 5/6 Republic vehicle capital ship. So a capital ship, which maybe a Piet cares about it. Each enemy non-leader unit gets -1/-0 for each damage on it and deal 5 indirect damage to a player. So obviously, this is looking to be something that you play. Hopefully, your opponent's just going to be like, I'm just going to take all my damage onto my units, and then you shrink all of their units down. I will say, generally, non-leader units aren't taking that much damage. What I mean by that is they oftentimes are just dying or dead, or they are full HP. Having a little bit of damage here and there doesn't oftentimes happen all that often, but you know, you have P38s, you have Cad Banes, you got things like that that can kind of sprinkle in some damage. What about something like Cad Bane? Do I find that this card could be good enough? Probably not. I don't think it really fits the style of Cad Bane in general. Not an underworld card, also not something that you really want to be playing on your 7 resource turn. Also, you need to be an aggressive deck for this to really shine when it's played, because obviously the idea, as I mentioned, is you play it, your opponent, oh, I can't take the damage to my base, I gotta deal to all my units, and suddenly my units are incredibly small. But if they're just able to take it to their base, it's just a 7 resource 5/6 in space, which is pretty bad. It's pretty bad. This is interesting, I will say. You can't now, there are 2 of them out, which is a little bit unfortunate because it is a vehicle. So I'm just not really convinced as to what this is really here for. Obviously, there could be some indirect damage decks, but as far as we've seen, Cunning doesn't really do a crazy amount of indirect damage. And again, it is a Republic card. Not that you necessarily have to play it a Republic deck, but it just doesn't really fit the style that I imagine for this card. Like, indirect damage decks tend to want to be a little bit more aggressive so they can take advantage of the indirect damage a little bit better. But I guess we will have to see. I'm just not a huge fan of this one, but it is a legendary, I suppose. Next up, we got Tantive IV. It's a 7 cost space unit in heroism. It's a 5/7 rebel vehicle capital ship. Another capital ship. Not really usable in Piet though, because it's a heroism card. It's got Sentinel, and when played, you create an X-Wing token, which is a 2/2. So, interesting card. Rebel tag is relevant, as per usual. The fact that it is a 5/7 Sentinel is interesting, right? 7 cost units has Sentinel. 7 is really late in the game. We've seen this with like Obi-Wan, for example. Getting down these really expensive Sentinels that presumably have a pretty decent body that can stop the assault in one arena seems good at first glance. The problem with it is that it just gets waylaid or Enfys nested. I mean, this can't necessarily because it has to be pumped up, or Enfys has to be pumped up in terms of power, but it just gets, stalled. And at that point, when you need a Sentinel and it's 7 cost, the stalling aspect of getting waylaid or having it removed immediately is just way too hard to deal with. So if you need a Sentinel, I don't really think this fits the goal. This is more like a value piece, and I don't think it's enough value. Maybe if there's an absolute ton of space decks that some of these Sentinels could get a little bit more valuable. Maybe you can put like a leader pilot on it so that it doesn't get waylaid. That could be something, I suppose, but it is 7 cost. And I don't think the when play trigger is worthwhile enough to really see all that much worth or value. But next up, we've got Massassi Tactical Officer. It's a 1 cost aggression heroism unit. It's a 0/4 rebel and it has this action to attack with a fighter unit. It gets +2/+0 for this attack. So a very interesting card because it is a rebel, so that can trigger any sort of rebel synergies, which is potentially interesting. It is a ground unit. It is a unit that costs 1, which means you can pair it with other potential 1-cost rebels like R2, which does have some potential. And it has this action which kind of wants you to be in space, right? Because the fighters are like your A-wings, the Y-wings, the Red 3s, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, came out just kind of after we went over Luke, which is pretty interesting, but I don't really see this being all that great. If you just think about this, okay, I want to use this and I want to use it for the +2/+0. Maybe you could go ahead and get some value in terms of making your A-wing trade up into one of their bigger space units. That's about the best thing this can do. Because if you're just attacking the base, you'd rather just play a 1-cost ground unit that actually has power, like 3 power or 2 power in of itself. Because now this thing doesn't do anything on its own and it requires you to have a fighter unit, which is pretty unfortunate. But maybe there's something there. If your opponent has big space units that you really want to go ahead and charge into with some big power, maybe this tactical officer could do some work, but I don't really see it. On another note, we got some new cards. These are the ones from today, and this one looks really sweet, actually. It's a 3-cost space unit, Victor Leader, Command Villainy, 2/4 Imperial Vehicle Fighter. Each other friendly space unit gets +1/+1. So we actually have an Anthem effect, and I say Anthem as that is kind of the magic term where there was a card called Glorious Anthem, and it would give units or creatures +1/+1, that type of effect. And so this is what I consider an Anthem effect or a Lord effect, where it's pumping up a specific type of unit or classification of unit. And this just seems really solid, right? A 2/4, 4/3 is just slightly below rates, right? We're seeing 3/4s, generally speaking, is what we want on a 3-cost space unit. This is just a little bit less, but you make up for that if you have any other space units, because any other space unit, you're going to get that additional power on them. Now, we'll get to Darth Vader in a moment, but this card is absurd if you are playing that type of Darth Vader deck, because you could potentially get massive value from it. Now, can you really get a ton of value without playing the new Darth Vader Leader? Again, we'll talk about that in a moment. There aren't that many 1-cost space units, but there are a few additional ones from set 4 that are worth playing. In set 1, we had TIE Fighter, which is a 2/1 for 1. That's a reasonable one to play. We've seen that in the past. We've seen a few other 1-cost space units, but a lot of them are in different aspects, which is a little bit tricky. So you really want something else, maybe things that are generating multiple bodies, multiple space tokens that can do some work, as we are getting the space tokens from the new set. But to be honest, this to me really does look like a Darth Vader unit and nothing else. It is absolutely sweet, but until we see more space units that we can really take advantage out of this guy, I guess we'll hold off on the insane excitement outside of Darth Vader. Next up, we've got I Have You Now. It's a 1-cost event in Cunning Villainy. Attack with a vehicle unit. Prevent all damage that will be dealt to it during this attack. This one is interesting because it essentially gives you the ability to use up an attack to kill off a unit. Potentially. Obviously, you don't even have to kill off a unit. It could just deal some damage and not die. But this, I would have to say, is just generally worse than Shoot First. If you're in a situation where this is good, I would say most of the time Shoot First would just be better. So let's say you have like a punishing one and your opponent has a punishing one and you wanted to use I Have You Now to try to kill the punishing one or attack the punishing one without having your unit be dealt damage. Well, Shoot First would actually give you the additional power and the ability to have not taken any damage from the punishing one in return. So it would just be better. Now, I'm trying to think of the situations where you would want this over something like Shoot First. And remember, Shoot First is just straight up cunning. So it would be literally able to be used in place of I Have You Now. And you don't have the restriction of being forced to attack with a vehicle unit. And the really big scenario that I think of with I Have You Now is if your opponent has a Sentinel and you use this and you wouldn't have been able to kill it with Shoot First. And now you have some some damage on that Sentinel and your unit doesn't die. But you really want to be using an attack plus this card to just do a little bit of damage to a Sentinel? Probably not. Probably not. So I'm not a huge fan of this one necessarily. Perhaps there's something that I'm not thinking of, some sort of combo potential that someone else has found out, but not that exciting. But now we get to the most exciting thing about today. And I hyped it up with that other unit. The brand new Darth Vader unit. This is a command villainy card. It has an action: if you attack with a non-token vehicle unit this phase, create a TIE Fighter token. And as you know, the TIE Fighter tokens are basically battle droids in space. The TIE Fighters are 1/1 space units, and they do, because they're space units, have the ability to get pumped up by that new card, which is absolutely sweet. It also has the vehicle and fighter tag, which is pretty awesome. Now, Darth Vader himself does deploy for 6 resources and is a Force Imperial vehicle, Imperial Sith pilot. He is a 5/6 if he is a unit, and a +5/+5 as an upgrade. And when you deploy it as an upgrade, you get 2 TIE Fighter tokens to back you up. Now, honestly, I look at these pilots and I immediately look at their stat line, because I'm like, okay, honestly, usually you're using this as a finisher, because at this point, it's going to be immediately readied up damage for the most part, and you're just going to get in for some damage. But this front side action, +5/+5 is great in terms of ending out the game. The 2 TIE Fighter tokens, I think, are going to be minimal value, but really it's this front side action that I think is really interesting and has a lot of potential. Now, you do need to have a vehicle, but if you're going this direction where you're going to create a bunch of go wide space tokens, you're probably going to have a bunch of space units, right? If that's the case, every single unit you attack with is going to be a vehicle unit. We have a couple of new vehicles in the new set. Things like the First Order TIE Fighter, for one. It's a 2/1, and it has that while you control a token unit, get raid 1, so it could potentially be a 3/1 in space. That seems pretty interesting with Darth Vader. Obviously, the TIE Fighter itself, that would give you 2 different turn 1 options for 1 resources in space that are pretty reasonable. You also have things like TIE Silencer. You have a whole smattering, realistically, of turn 1 space units at this point. And then you can kind of just back that up every single turn, right? Turn 1, you play a space unit. Turn 2, you attack. You create a TIE Fighter token. You play the new Lord effect of getting +1/+1 to all your space units. Now your TIE Fighter token is a 2/2. And if your turn 1 play also lived, or potentially both turn 1 plays also lived, you could even play that fighter beforehand to pump them up for even more damage. And that can get really insane really quickly if you're creating a TIE Fighter token every single turn. And I do think there is potential to do so if we get more turn 1 space units, which I am pretty reasonably confident that we have a good chance of getting those. And also, if we are going to get potentially turn 1 units that are 1 cost, so you can play multiple to guarantee that you're going to start putting tokens out on turn 2. And as I mentioned, that earlier space unit that gives all space units +1/+1 can be played later on when you do have 3 or 4 tokens out with Darth Vader. And Darth Vader can then be piloted into one of those TIE Fighter tokens. You're almost always going to have a target to put Darth Vader in, which is going to give you that immediately +5/+5 damage. Of course, the 5/6 unit itself would have given you that damage too, but now you can pilot it onto one of your units to get an attack in with them, which can be kind of nice. But I do think this guy has a lot of potential as just a very, very go wide, smack him down space leader. And that has a lot of excitement to me. Also, because we're going to go all space, the pilot options aren't limited to non-token units. So any pilot that you want to include in the deck, which there are a lot of them now, you would be able to pilot into all of your different TIE Fighter tokens that Darth Vader had created. If I were to look here, what are the ones that I'm most kind of interested in? Dengar could be pretty good with the indirect damage, although I don't know if that's really all that insane. If you're going the cutting direction, you have like the Mandalorian to get +3/+1. Same with the Boba Fett, where you're going to get +2/+3 and that little bit of damage. I'll say we haven't really seen all that many amazing pilots on the villainy side of things, because most of them have been like heroism. You know, you have Anakin, Han, R2, Biggs, and that type of stuff that we've been seeing a lot of. But there is some potential for Darth Vader to have some more pilots going forward, which could, you know, get a lot more valuable, because you're going to guarantee yourself to have a vehicle space unit out, which is going to be pretty sweet. So Darth Vader, I think there's a lot of potential here, and I am excited to see a go wide space deck potentially be viable. Love that. Also, very cool to see this, where you have Luke, who's wanting you to play a bunch of space units and attack, and then those pings are going to deal with the TIE Fighter tokens that Darth Vader has to balance each other out. Absolutely love that, by the way. But that's going to be it. That's all the cards we have for today. I will say there was one other thing that I wanted to share with you all before I ended up the video. There it is. The new showcases for, I believe, the tournament, the Galactic Championship wins. So new Luke Skywalker showcase and Darth Vader showcase, which I'm not going to lie, they're my favorite showcases. There's just something very nostalgic, something very classic, very simple art, but I see it, and unlike any other showcase that we have so far, I almost feel the scene and feel what's going on, which is really, really cool. So absolutely love that. But let me know what you think about the new cards. Let me know what you think about Darth Vader. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.